Well, I'd like to begin by thanking Mami for the invitation to come to give a talk in the context of this Biennale, which I've seen in part only, but I will hope to see the rest in the next few days, and to congratulate her on a remarkable show. In thinking about the 1996 Biennale, I really only started to look back on it when the invitation came a little while ago. And at first, in asking Melissa Radcliffe, who was very helpful in organizing and facilitating my visit here, and to whom I owe many thanks, she said, well, think about it in terms of your practice and how it spoke to that. And I thought initially it might mean thinking about how I came to conceptualize it and formulate it. And then when I looked at the catalog and the list of artists, I thought it's actually been so productive in terms of what I've done subsequently that rather than see it as the culmination of some years of practice as a curator, I might see it as a starting point. So that will be the frame in which the lecture or the talk will develop. And I also would start by saying in 1996, it was the moment really of enormous interest worldwide in new technologies, in camera-based work and in the shifting from analog to digital media, and in the development of the World Wide Web, CD-ROMs, and really many new tools, and much speculation on what that meant. And since biennales are often laboratories for new ideas, I think far more these days than in most museums, biennales are quicker off their feet, they're more nimble, they're more responsive, more reactive. And so that's where we've often seen the envelope being pushed curatorially. And in 1996, although I wasn't aware of it as I developed my thoughts, other curators were also responding to these new technologies. And the 1996 Lyon Biennale is famously one that was devoted to camera-based arts, almost exclusively. And the Gwangju Biennale of that year also was very heavily concentrated on that. And so broadly speaking, as we look back, you might see that as the touchstone. I took a slightly different tack as what in retrospect sounds rather a clumsy title, Jurassic Technologies Revenant. But I was trying to get at the idea of reproductive technologies that didn't simply come out of the latest developments in camera-based moving imagery, and to think about other kinds of reproductive media, going back through texts and books and multiples and textiles and the like. So the show stretched from textiles and other art forms through camera-based still photography, film, the film program in this auditorium, and the like. However, as I look back a month or so ago, I was struck by a different concentration that one, in retrospect or with hindsight, that I think can be pulled out of that show. And I'm starting by showing you one of a number of objects that was contributed by Frédéric Brulé-Bourbré, whose work I'd been involved with in a two-person show at the Dia Art Foundation, co-curated with André Magnin, that put together the work of Alighiero Boetti, the Italian artist, and Frédéric Brulé-Bourbré. And Brulé-Bourbré was a man who'd grown up in the Ivory Coast with very little schooling. He was from the Bete people, and the language they spoke had never been written down. And through the early jobs he had in French institutions, in the colonial administration, he was around anthropologists and others and felt the importance of a written language, that if collective memory, communal memory, and history are to remain beyond oral traditions, a written language is absolutely fundamental. And he developed a syllabary with some 470 letters that was based on, in part on divination, on a very particular kind of stone that was indigenous to that part of the Côte d'Ivoire where he lived, and produced books like this one, which had a written alphabet. He also codified cultural practices through drawings of many different kinds. And you see here drawings of faces with scarification and then descriptions of them in more abstract terms. And in looking back, I was struck by the fact that he's a self-taught artist, one might say, and yet the self-taught part is really incidental to the larger anthropological practice. It's not that he was that he wasn't academically trained, which discipline would have been more fundamental, anthropology, fine arts, or so on. And it's in that those questions and the kind of understanding that's implied in these books that have proved so fundamental, I think, to work I've done subsequently. And of course, also in the exhibition was Alighiero Boetti, an Italian artist who early on turned to the hands of others to realize his work, with a very broad vision, a cosmology that looked at systems of knowledge, of mensuration, of cartography, of knowledge in many forms. Boetti had, through travels to Afghanistan, had come to rely on the embroidery of women in Afghanistan who would carry out the text, actually embroider the text for his work. And this was done not through direct engagement with them because the cultural practices were such that he could not engage with women in those communities, but through intermediaries. But his practice from the late 70s through the 90s was largely made by women who were producing the kind of embroidery or using techniques that were part of their vernacular traditions, but with a content that was entirely different. Also in the exhibition was work by Francesco Clemente, an Italian artist who spent a great deal of time in India, and his long sojourns there had impacted not only the iconography in his work, but also his practice. And this particular body of work depends again on vernacular artists. He's engaged someone working in local traditions to develop a story that is essentially Clemente's in terms of its narrative, but the vernacular artists in terms of the visual languages it uses. Also present were textiles by Nia Fliam and Nismoyo, a duo working in Indonesia who sought to bring back vernacular traditions of batik work where the vocabulary was very directly related to metaphysical and spiritual traditions. And their work was done at a time in Indonesia where the political restrictions on the community practices of different groups within Indonesia were under fire, and where the government was trying to homogenize and control culture, so that what might look on the face of it to be a rather traditional or conventional revival technique actually had a valence, a political valence, that's more radical than it appears at face value. And also in the exhibition was work by Emily Onware, which will be familiar to all of you, and this was specifically batik works before the paintings on canvas. And again, it was I was interested in the introduction of techniques associated with one culture, Indonesia most immediately, into a metaphysical system, a value system from another culture. And so I'm singling out that particular group of work to see it as generative of work that I've done subsequently, and to talk about what I think of as, or what Hal Foster has talked about as the ethnographic term. That was first introduced in an important essay he wrote in the 90s. It was not an essay I was thinking about at the time of making the exhibition. It's one that has had currency for a great many artist practices of the 90s who were not in the Biennale I made. But it identifies ways of thinking about vernacular traditions and you might even say forms of colonialism, using and drawing on, appropriating other cultures into one's own practice, and the ways in which this can be done positively, legitimately, and the ways in which it's deeply problematic. And so what I'm turning to now is a work by the Belgian-born, Mexico-based artist Francis Solis, and a project we did together that began around 2004, I think, and that still continues. It's based on a collection that Elise made originally out of his own interest of paintings by amateurs, Sunday painters and others, of a saint called Fabiola, whom you see here, who lived in the 4th century and did good deeds and was canonized very quickly after her death in the 4th century, and seems not to have had any representations for centuries. And then in the late 19th century, a French academician, Jean-Jacques Henner, made the first portrait of her, obviously a total invention. And it showed her in profile, looking left as we look at the painting, with this dark red headscarf. And it's faintly Venetian. He's looking at Venetian models to invent this portrait. It became hugely successful, and then it got lost. So the actual painting is only known through reproduction, and there seem to be no chapels anywhere in any known churches dedicated to this woman. But nonetheless, there's a vast amount of works in the world, but none in museums, art museums, because they operate at a totally different level, in a totally different set of orbits from fine art. And what Elise is interested in accumulating them, and he's got them initially from junk shops and antique flea markets and the like for almost nothing. Often the frames were more valuable than the paintings, is two things. One is that although the paintings all look alike, in that for validity they need to conform to the basic iconography, it's very hard to paint this, even reproduced painting, very well. And the interpretive techniques that the artists go through. So he's interested in them aesthetically, and he's interested in the anthropology or the ethnography of it. Like how can, or the fact that there are different systems circulating in which art production is going on that's of apparently no interest to art historians and no interest to fine art museums. And so that's what the project's about. It has these dual things. And so when I was talking to him about realizing it, and we worked on it for quite a long time, he said, yes, this is all fine, but you can't put it in a white cube gallery. And of course, that was the space I had. And so it was my charge to go and find another space to put it in, because the frame he wanted for it was not to turn it into contemporary art, as such a kind of positioning might do, but to situate it in ways that set other discourses in motion. And so initially, I've persuaded the Hispanic Society, which is a place in northwest side of Manhattan that has a collection of Spanish Old Master painting to let me hang it in there, which is what we did. And it was there for 9 months, which was sort of the standard length of time of Dia shows, and then it started to travel. And it's traveled since, I think, around 2004 to the present. It's currently at Menil in Houston in the former Byzantine chapel, which is now a multi-faith chapel, which is a great context for it. And it's been, I think the photograph on the left is at the National Portrait Gallery. In a rare bending of the rules, they agreed to show it, even though this cannot be an authenticatable portrait of Fabiola, which is one of the kind of rules or precepts they work by. And this one on the right is, this is Menil, in fact, in the Byzantine chapel. But it's been at a monastery in Spain, it's been in a cloister in Guadalajara in Mexico, and so on. And over time, as we've hung it over and over, I've begun to get to know the paintings individually. Not all of it. I mean, I recognize them over and over. And I'm more and more persuaded by Francis's set of concerns about the aesthetics and how we judge and who judges and on behalf of whom. I want to turn now to another artist who set up, or whose work set up a set of questions which I think come out of the roots of what I isolated in the '96 Biennale. And that's James Castle. And it was seeing a show of his work in 2007 that the Philadelphia Museum of Art organized that made a deep impression on me. And thinking about in some ways, thinking about Broglie-Beaubré's work in relation to this, I think, is quite productive. Castle worked as a reclusive artist, you might say, for some 4 decades. There's a vast body of drawings, some constructions, and books. None of it is dated, and it really didn't come to the attention of curators and art historians till after his death. So it's very difficult to date it and organize it. But I can put it into groupings. And what you're looking at here are 2 small drawings about this big. And this is a technique he developed and used most often. It's a combination of saliva and soot from a wood-burning stove that makes this, these very subtle grays that give an effect that is quasi-photographic in some ways, or like very beautiful 19th century watercolors in some senses. And as you can see on the left, you're looking at an interior scene with a door, the edge of a door head on, and the door opens onto other spaces, in a very complex recession that's both legible spatially and also brought right up onto the picture plane. And on the right, you're seeing a detail of a barn. And then I'll show you some of the constructions he made. And these are, the paper he worked on was always found. This is on found material, found as in used, already printed. His mother had the village post office, so a vast amount of stuff was coming through, and he reused it. And the constructions are mainly of figure-like forms, as you see on the right, or there are a few of objects. This is a blue and white jug, and we're looking at it foreshortened, so the handle is, you're looking dead on the handle, and the jug, you can see its lip on the far side. And these are constructed by stitching. And then there are other kinds of constructions. See this on the right, where he's playing with the word place and lace and the kind of graphics of lace within the term place. And on the right, you see an interior, probably of a barn, in which there's an exhibition of his own works hung So you see some of those figures. There are constructions of birds, and you see the birds up on the rafters. There are farm scenes and the like. What gives this a special twist, I think, is the fact that Castle did these without anybody else seeing him do them. He did them in a barn, or he did them in a room in the house, but other family members didn't observe them, and he didn't discuss them with him. He was born profoundly deaf, and he never learned to sign or to read, and his family supported his activity but left him to do it himself. And as I said, they didn't watch. So it seems to me that what he's done is he's come to self-identify as an artist without any direct models at hand, and he's come to make painting, or there are paintings, many drawings. The drawings are all done from memory. Nothing is done as an in situ drawing. He's using text, although he doesn't read. He has an uncanny ability to understand the role of text in a variety of forms. And he's conceptualized exhibitions, which either he saw or he saw only in memory. And it was thinking about that whole creative practice and the way in which an artist can develop a set of skills like the one that you saw in the drawing with the recession of the doors opening onto doors and doors, that goes far beyond what most of us might normally expect to find in a naive, self-taught, folk, visionary. Those are the kind of terms we use for self-taught artists. And I think it presses very hard on what we think of as creative practice, and also where that creative practice should be situated culturally. That seeing Castle's work ultimately led to doing a large exhibition myself of the work for Spain, and it's been seen more and more these days. And the second artist I want to turn to is Martín Ramirez, and this is a slightly different narrative, but also an illuminating one. And again, I was struck by it in seeing a show that was organized by, not by an art museum like the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is an encyclopedic museum that has work from many cultures and eras, but from at the Folk Art Museum in New York. And Ramirez's work is also drawing-based. These are very large drawings, as you can see. They're made from paper that's had another history that he's glued together, and they comprise some biblical or religious subjects, as you see on the Madonna on the right, and a great many works that involve trains moving through landscapes. Martín Ramirez was an immigrant to the US in the 20s from a small ranch in the north of Mexico. He came looking for work and seems to have worked on the railroads briefly before having some kind of breakdown and being institutionalized. And he spent the remainder of his life in an institution for people with mental disabilities in California. And he did not speak. Not that he couldn't speak, but that the language he spoke, the form of Spanish, seemed to be unknown to anyone working in the institution, and he remained silent. And he did the drawings without prompting, and in the beginning had to hide them until psychoanalysts working there saw them as remarkable and began saving them and keeping them. And Ramirez's work came to the attention of a Chicago artist, Jim Nutt, in the late 60s, who acquired them all, this one body of work from the psychoanalyst, and through those channels, the workers then entered the fine art world. And when it did initially, it was shown by Nutt and some of his associates in Chicago, who were known as imagists, Gladys Nielsen and others, in shows with their own work. that is on par with their work, without distinction, not as folk art or art of the mentally ill or any other classificatory system which would take it out of the realm of galleries and institutions of fine art. Of course, we don't tend to see it in museums and in galleries, or we haven't, not despite the efforts of Nutt and others in the 70s. And then I want to turn to Kara Walker, who's a well-known African-American artist, whose subject matter is Southern culture, the Belle Epoque of Southern culture, you might say, and the Civil War and slavery and African-American history. And she addresses that in a vocabulary she's well known for, these black silhouettes cut out in paper and applied to the gallery walls. And the scenes have narrative or anecdotal components, but they can't be parsed easily as a single unfolding narrative, and the kinds of oppression and violence and degradation and bestiality that's going on do not belong to one culture and not the other. They're not, cannot be unwrapped in that way. The black culture and white culture are so imbricated, they're inextricably interwoven. But in 2001, she made an unusual, or unusual within her vocabulary, installation which was called American Primitive, and she based it on this painting which you see on the right, which was probably made in the 1870s by an artist who's not been identified. And it's, as you can see, it uses racial stereotypes throughout. And it was a painting that was in a collection of, a well-known collection in the 1930s. It was shown quite widely. And in the 70s, I think it entered a public collection in the US. It is not shown any longer. And Walker unearthed it and then used it as the basis for this particular installation. And it was seeing that and seeing the Castle shows and the Ramirez shows that reinforced what I've been saying, the kinds of classificatory systems that determine what gets shown in museums, and the subcategories, such as folk art, vernacular art, isolated art, the art of the insane, and such like, that have over the decades been removed from current practice, from the orbits of contemporary museums today. And out of that nexus, and I think going back, looking at the work from the 96 biennial, one can see a lineage, and I'd say see the way in my practice, it's come to the fore increasingly. But it's not just mine. If you went to the 2013 Venice Biennale, the Encyclopedic Palace, you will remember that a great deal of that show also looked in different ways at work by self-taught artists and brought it into dialogue yet again, back into the contemporary art circuits as it used to be in the 20s and 30s, not only under the auspices of the Surrealists or later Dubuffet or Cobra, but in institutions like the Whitney and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I think I'm running out of time, am I? Someone keeping the clock? It's okay. I'll finish by looking at one more exhibition, which I did with Rosemary Trockel, called Cosmos in 2012 for the Reina Sofia, which then traveled to Serpentine in London and the New Museum in New York. This was an exhibition that originally was meant to be a retrospective. There hadn't been a show of Trockel's work in Spain for decades. She's an incredibly important artist, an artist I think has contributed and continues to contribute to the center of dialogue of practice in many ways, whether it's in relation to questions of feminism, whether it's in relation to the status and practices of work gendered as gendered female, whether it's in relation to craft, fine art hierarchies, and more. I knew Rosemary would not want to do a retrospective. It's simply not an exhibition typology she likes, and I was not going to get anywhere by proposing it. And so I started to think of another way we might find a form for bringing a body of her work together to form an exhibition. And so I asked her to think whether she'd think about a cosmos. Like, what was it that made up her imaginary? Like, what were the touchstones for it? And she could have interpreted that in a number of ways. It could have been that we brought together old master paintings that she valued, paintings of seminal teachers, some of her colleagues. I didn't know how she'd respond. But over time, we began to talk about various things. And it emerged that we drew up a list without ever defining quite what the threads were, but the threads became apparent as we agreed on bringing in work by certain other artists. And so what we ended up with was a show that I think situated her work in relation to dominant threads and practices within it that have to do with natural history, that have to do with crafts, and that have to do with non-sanctified practices, might be a way to put it. And so what you see in this slide are three vitrines in which there's a combination of objects, some of them hers and some of them work by other artists. So what you see, those birds stepped up on the right in the first vitrine are all works by James Castle. And there's a kind of firing range of pistols that are toy pistols, water pistols, that are cast in bronze, that is hers, and a couple of other works by her. There in the second one you see like a mannequin or a doll by an artist called Morton Bartlett, and I'll show you a bit more of that. And then there were natural history objects too. This is a very large crab that came from the Museum of Natural History in Delaware. And there were works that brought her own work into dialogue with natural history objects and imagery. And what you see here is a stack of those early knitted paintings, industrially knitted paintings that had brought her to international attention, which she'd cut up and put in this plexiglass vitrine and put this crab on top of it, and that they were installed in relation to drawings by James Audubon, a very famous compendium of birds of America, North America. There were other ways of thinking these legacies in Dali's aphrodisiac telephone. And here you see Bartlett's ballerina, which is, as you can see, 31 inches high. It's highly naturalistic. It was made by Bartlett himself reclusively, without showing it to anyone during his lifetime. And he dressed the doll and 14 others in a variety of costumes, which he made, and then photographed them. And it's the ballerina, above all, that has more photographs and more costumes. Bartlett's daily life was as a commercial illustrator and graphic designer. And so all of this hobby that went on in private, which was never spoken about, and as I said, never shown, was finally packed up late in his life and left to be found, which happened. And now these objects, having been brought to the attention of artists like Mike Kelly, again have renewed status, and for Rosemary it were very important. So I show you two more, and 2 more. And I'll leave it there. And summarize simply by saying these are paintings by an orangutan, Tilda, who's lived in the zoo in Cologne, who was also featured in this show. And this cross-species contribution, as much as the natural history objects, the paintings by non-credentialed artists, the whole range of work made sense, I think, in relation to Trockel's practice, and was given validity by Trockel's participation in this. I did not make these choices alone. But I think what they show is how often and how significantly it's been artists who are in the forefront of challenging curators to widen their practice, to think beyond the conventional categories, and to ask how this dispensation of privilege, which is a definition for curating, how that can best be generated. Thank you.